They thought he was just another black man to intimidate, just another name to file away and forget. But within minutes of mocking him, the courtroom flipped, and the judge who held all the power, she became the one answering questions she never thought she'd have to face. What happened inside that room would shake an entire city and change the rules of justice forever. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. At exactly 8:27 a.m., the oak doors of courtroom 3B at the Charleston County Courthouse creaked open. The room was already half full, a mosaic of quiet murmurs, crossed arms, and shifting eyes. There was something electric in the air that morning, something that clung to the walls with the weight of unspoken truths. The locals called it the Broderick effect. Attorneys knew it. Defendants feared it. And anyone who'd ever practiced law in this corner of South Carolina had felt its sting at least once. Judge Evelyn Broderick had presided over this courtroom for 25 years. Her reputation had grown like a thick vine, wrapping itself around the foundations of the county's justice system. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her sharp tongue and sharper bias cut cleaner than any gavel slam ever could. Her bench wasn't just a seat, it was a throne. And she wore her robe like armor, wielding it with precision, authority, and, when it suited her, cruelty. People said she never forgot a name, especially the ones she didn't like. Names like Malcolm Pierce. He wasn't new to her courtroom, but he was a problem. At 46, Malcolm Pierce had already built a name that stretched far beyond his Atlanta law firm. He had argued in front of federal judges and sat on panels about race and justice reform. But what made him truly dangerous was his composure. While others cracked under subtle threats or biting condescension, Malcolm studied it, memorized it, let it talk until it contradicted itself. Today, he stepped into courtroom 3B, not just as a defense attorney, but as a storm cloaked in a calm gray suit. His eyes scanned the room, not in intimidation, but calculation. Every bench, every bailiff, every eye that flicked toward him and then away. He moved like he belonged, even in a place designed to remind him he didn't. The case was State versus Isaiah Cooper, a 38-year-old black man, a decorated Marine veteran, now accused of assaulting an officer during a traffic stop. The footage, partially leaked, painted a far more complicated picture, one where Isaiah had been tased while seated, hands visible, no weapon, no resistance. But nuance rarely held weight in Judge Broderick's courtroom. Here, narrative ruled. And Isaiah's narrative was one she'd already rewritten in her head. Malcolm's client sat beside him, wrists shackled, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the floor like it had betrayed him. Malcolm leaned close and whispered, "You're not what they say you are. I just need you to trust me to prove it." The room quieted as the side door opened. Judge Broderick stepped in. She walked like she was stepping onto a stage, every movement choreographed. Her black heels echoed across the tile with chilling rhythm. She took her seat behind the bench, adjusted her glasses, and looked straight ahead without acknowledgement of anyone. Then her eyes landed on Malcolm. A thin smile touched her lips, not warm, but knowing. She adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, tapped her pen once, then leaned into the mic. "Mr. Pierce," she said, voice smooth like silk pulled too tightly. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Charleston's courtroom's not quite high profile enough for you these days?" It was meant as a jab, dressed in civility. Malcolm didn't blink. "I go where justice fails, Your Honor. That tends to be in more places than I'd like." The courtroom shifted, a few eyebrows raised. A bailiff straightened. But Judge Broderick only smiled wider, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Well," she said, looking back to her docket, "try to keep the soapbox moments to a minimum. We're not filming a documentary." She laughed softly to herself. The laughter echoed longer than it should have. And just like that, the stage was set. Opening statements were scheduled for 10. The gallery was full. Reporters had begun to trickle in, not because of the case itself, but because word had gotten out. Malcolm Pierce was going head-to-head with Charleston's Iron Lady. It wasn't a trial. It was a showdown, and those didn't happen often. Isaiah sat quietly beside Malcolm, visibly tense. He glanced once toward the jury box, still empty, but already sensing he didn't stand a chance. Malcolm placed a hand gently on the table, a silent signal of stability. He knew this wasn't about Isaiah alone. This was about every Isaiah who never got their name cleared. Every black defendant who was spoken over, passed over, walked over. And Judge Broderick? She knew it too. She tilted her head, scanning the room like a director preparing for curtain call. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and said, "Let's make one thing clear, Mr. Pierce. I don't tolerate grandstanding, race baiting, or courtroom theatrics. If you're planning on putting on a show, I suggest you take it to Broadway." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I've come to present evidence, Your Honor. But if what you're doing here qualifies as theater, I'll simply play my part." The room froze. The silence wasn't awkward. It was loaded. A few murmurs swirled in the back row. One reporter started scribbling faster. Broderick's jaw clenched. This wasn't going to be another trial. It was going to be a reckoning. Neither of them would say it. Not yet. But everyone could feel it. What no one could know was that before the sun set on this courtroom, the woman who just laughed at Malcolm Pierce would be escorted out not as a judge, but as a suspect. The fall always starts at the top, and Broderick had no idea she'd already begun to slip. The courtroom had always been her domain, a place where the walls seemed to lean inward toward her bench, like disciples drawn to a prophet. Judge Evelyn Broderick didn't just preside. She commanded, orchestrating each trial like a composer guiding her personal symphony of control. That morning, as she adjusted her robe with the poise of someone utterly assured of her own power, she had no idea the structure she had built, one of intimidation and silent compliance, was beginning to fracture, not from the outside, but from the inside. Malcolm Pierce stood at the defense table, his posture calm but coiled. His client, Isaiah Cooper, sat beside him, present in body, but visibly absent in spirit. Malcolm had seen that look too many times. The look of a black man dragged into a courtroom, not for justice, but for punishment, pre-approved by tradition. Judge Broderick began the morning proceedings with an edge sharper than necessary. "Mr. Pierce, are we ready to begin?" Or are you still organizing your theater props? She asked, eyes already darting to the court reporter before he could answer. We're ready, Your Honor, Malcolm replied evenly. He had no interest in matching her pettiness, only in exposing it. The prosecution, led by Assistant DA Ethan Ridgway, barely concealed his smirk. Young, white, and eager, Ridgway was precisely the type Broderick favored. Pliable, ambitious, and willing to weaponize procedure for the sake of appearances. As opening statements began, Ridgway painted Isaiah as agitated, threatening, and dangerous, using terms that masked their racial undertones in legalese. Malcolm watched silently, hands folded, until his turn came. He rose slowly, his voice clear and measured as he addressed the jury. Isaiah Cooper is a father, a decorated Marine, a man who served this country with distinction. The prosecution wants to convince you that he is defined by a single moment, one we intend to prove never occurred the way they say it did. He took a breath, then continued. But I ask you, what if the system is more comfortable believing he's guilty than asking if it was wrong? Before Malcolm could sit down, Broderick cut in. Mr. Pierce, you will refrain from philosophical grandstanding. This court deals in facts, not moral hypotheticals. Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't need to. The subtle shift in the jury's body language told him they had heard what mattered. The trial pressed on, each exchange more tense than the last. Malcolm cross-examined the arresting officer, pointing out discrepancies in his written report versus his testimony. He questioned the placement of body cam footage, why it began after the most critical moment, and challenged the lack of any physical evidence tying Isaiah to the alleged assault. Each time he made headway, Broderick found a way to undercut him. Objection, relevance, Ridgway would call out. Sustained, Broderick replied, before Malcolm could finish his sentence. Objection, leading. Sustained. Objection, argumentative. Sustained. It was a rhythm, a pattern, one so precise it didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The walls of her courtroom didn't just echo her decisions, they amplified them. But what Broderick failed to recognize was how visible her hand had become. The jury, though silent, had begun to fidget. A woman in the back row of the gallery, who had sat stone-faced through the first hour, now leaned forward. Even the court reporter's pen strokes seemed more deliberate, as if bracing for history. Then came the moment that would cement the unraveling. Malcolm called a new witness, an independent forensic analyst who had reviewed the footage and timing discrepancies. Before the man could complete his third sentence, Ridgway objected. Your Honor, this witness wasn't disclosed in our original pretrial documents. Malcolm stepped forward. That's false. His name was included in the amended list submitted to the clerk's office last Wednesday. Broderick narrowed her eyes. I don't recall seeing such an amendment. I have the time-stamped copy here, Your Honor, Malcolm said, lifting a document. She didn't ask for it. Instead, she turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, please disregard the last few statements. The defense has attempted to introduce surprise evidence without proper notification. Malcolm's voice dropped a register. Your Honor, with respect, the only thing being surprised here is the truth. The room froze. Broderick's eyes flared. One more comment like that, Mr. Pierce, and you'll be held in contempt. Malcolm didn't break eye contact. Contempt, he repeated softly, is watching justice be strangled by formality. For the first time, she hesitated. Then she snapped, Enough. This witness is dismissed. The forensic analyst stepped down, confused, but Malcolm didn't protest. Not aloud. Instead, he turned to his client. Isaiah's hands gripped the edge of the table. His face was tight, breath controlled, like a man trying not to drown in a storm he couldn't even name. Malcolm leaned in and whispered, "We're not losing. We're collecting. Collecting glances, notes, violations. Every cut, every dodge, every moment Broderick tried to silence him was being written into a separate record, one she would never be able to edit." Outside the courtroom, the air was shifting. Quiet murmurs were building momentum in the courthouse hallways. The local press, usually indifferent to the quiet tragedies of the courtroom, had taken notice. Something in this case, perhaps Malcolm's unwavering poise, perhaps Broderick's blatant bias, had cracked the dam of indifference. And inside, as the prosecution rested its case and the court recessed for lunch, Judge Broderick sat straighter than ever, satisfied with the control she thought she had maintained. But Malcolm Pierce knew better. He knew this wasn't about winning over the judge. It was about letting the walls speak louder than the bench. And before the end of the day, those walls would begin to crumble. As the courtroom buzzed faintly during the lunch recess, Malcolm remained seated at the defense table, slowly turning over a flash drive in his hand, a seemingly insignificant object, but one that held more power than anyone in that room could have guessed. It hadn't been part of his original plan. In fact, it had arrived that very morning, slipped into a manila envelope, and left anonymously at the front desk of his hotel with no note, no return address. Only the words, "Play this before closing arguments," scribbled in slanted handwriting. He wasn't one to gamble on mystery, but something told him this wasn't a bluff. As his client Isaiah stepped out with a deputy for a brief lunch break, Malcolm plugged the drive into his laptop at the defense table, surrounded by the murmuring hum of court clerks and reporters recharging their phones. He clicked on the lone video file. What filled the screen stopped his breath. It was courtroom footage, not of Isaiah's case, but another one, from 3 years prior. The video clearly showed Judge Broderick seated at her bench, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. A black defendant stood at the podium, barely audible, until the judge cut him off mid-sentence with a now familiar tone. But that wasn't the shock. What followed was a private sidebar, accidentally left recording on the courtroom microphone. Broderick leaned toward the prosecution, unaware the mic was live. "He'll plead. They always do. Just push him a little harder. We'll move this along. I don't have time to waste on another one of them." The courtroom air, already heavy with tension, thickened. Malcolm leaned back, pulse quickening. The casual racism, the manipulation. It wasn't just present. It was documented, captured. And suddenly, everything made sense. The blocked witnesses, the thrown out evidence, the disproportionate rulings. It wasn't incompetence. It was orchestration. Malcolm's hand hovered over the keyboard, weighing the nuclear option. If he played the file in open court, it would be irreversible. He could destroy her career in seconds. But was the timing right? Just then, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "You're not the only one she's buried. Time to dig her up." His decision was made. When the court reconvened, the room settled into its familiar hierarchy. Judge Broderick returned, as poised as ever, her eyes skimming past Malcolm with the faintest smirk. But Malcolm didn't flinch, because now he held something she couldn't interrupt, overrule, or dismiss, and he was about to press play. When the court reconvened after lunch, the walls of courtroom 3B seemed quieter than before. But it wasn't the kind of silence that calms. It was the kind that coils itself around the ribs and waits for something to snap. Judge Evelyn Broderick took her seat with the air of someone who believed she'd already won. Her posture proud, her voice just a touch more clipped than it had been in the morning session. But if she noticed the difference in the atmosphere, she didn't show it. Or perhaps she did and simply didn't care. Malcolm Pierce, however, noticed everything. The way a juror paused slightly before sitting. The glance exchanged between two spectators in the back row. Even the bailiff, who had spent years at Broderick's side with unquestioned loyalty, avoided eye contact for the first time. Malcolm had seen it before. The slow erosion of fear. The moment when silence begins to feel like complicity. And now, he had something more powerful than any legal brief or carefully worded motion. He had evidence. A truth caught on camera, not staged or edited, but raw and damning. What had been whispered in corners was now a recording waiting to be heard. And in less than an hour, it would play in a courtroom that had silenced voices like his for decades. But for now, he waited. The court moved into closing arguments. Ridgway, the young assistant district attorney, rose first, smoothing his tie as if it were a badge of righteousness. His voice rang with that practiced, confident cadence of someone convinced that if he hit the right tone, the facts wouldn't matter. He painted Isaiah Cooper as a man who had snapped, who had disrespected lawful authority, and who was a threat to civil order. It was a performance. But one Broderick watched approvingly, her chin nodding almost imperceptibly, like a metronome keeping the rhythm of his closing cadence. When Ridgway finished, Malcolm rose with no theatrics, no pacing, no gesturing. He stood with his hands resting lightly on the defense table, eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the gallery, but on the jurors, on the people who still had a choice to make. Isaiah Cooper did not snap. He began, his voice calm. He didn't swing, didn't threaten, didn't resist. What he did was something far more threatening to a system that doesn't expect people like him to speak at all. He stayed calm. He asked questions. He asked for respect. He let that linger. Respect, he repeated, is not a privilege. It's a right. And when the footage we showed earlier was suppressed, when testimony was cut off, when every attempt to explain was overruled, you saw what happens when that right is stripped. Judge Broderick shifted slightly in her seat. Malcolm could see her fingers tighten around her pen. And maybe, he continued, you felt it too. Not the fear of being arrested, but the fear of being unheard, of being dismissed before your words ever leave your mouth. That's what Isaiah felt that night. That's what many of us feel every day. He turned slowly toward the judge's bench. And in some rooms, in some courts, that silence isn't an accident. It's by design. A pin could have dropped. He stepped back from the podium, nodding once toward Isaiah, whose eyes met his for the first time that day, not with fear, but something close to hope. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce," Broderick said, her voice tight. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will now begin deliberations." But she didn't finish, because Malcolm raised his hand, calmly but decisively. "Your Honor, before the jury is dismissed, the defense has one final submission. Newly surfaced material directly relevant to this trial's impartiality. Broderick's eyes narrowed. The time for evidence has passed, Mr. Pierce. This is not evidence against my client, Malcolm said smoothly. It's evidence regarding this court. The room stiffened. Proceed carefully, Broderick said, her tone warning. Malcolm took a breath. Then, without further comment, he reached over to the laptop on the table, turned it toward the court's projection screen, and pressed play. A grainy video flickered to life. The courtroom from 3 years ago. Broderick on the bench. Her voice clear as crystal. They always plead. Just push him. I don't have time for another one of them. The audio filled the room like a bomb detonation. Not shouted, not exaggerated, just said, with a cruel kind of routine. Gasps, murmurs. One juror covered their mouth. Another leaned forward as if to make sure what they were hearing was real. Broderick's gavel slammed down once, twice. Turn that off. This is inappropriate. It's your voice, Malcolm said, unmoved. This is what you said, in this courtroom, about a defendant who looked like my client. You didn't care about the facts then, and you don't now. I said turn it off, Broderick snapped, rising from her chair. I will, once you answer for it. The bailiff stood, unsure whether to move toward the bench or the projector. Malcolm looked directly at the jury. You've heard a lot this week, but what you just heard tells you everything you need to know about how this trial was handled. Isaiah Cooper sat frozen, staring up at the judge, who only minutes before had looked untouchable. Now, the robe seemed heavier, the authority thinner. The room had turned, and Malcolm Pierce stood at its center, not shouting, not pleading, just shining a light into the darkest corner. The storm hadn't erupted yet, but the clouds were cracking, and Evelyn Broderick had just heard the thunder. The silence that followed the playback of the recording was unlike anything the courtroom had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of routine decorum or quiet respect. It was the kind that seeps into bones, the kind that announces something sacred had just been shattered. Judge Evelyn Broderick stood behind her bench, visibly shaken, though she tried to keep her expression composed. But no amount of poise could erase what had just played for all to hear. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a truth laid bare. A truth that had lived in whispers, in quiet nods between attorneys, in the resignation of defendants who understood the game was never meant for them. And now, the mask had fallen. The voice in the video wasn't only recognizable, it was unmistakably hers. In the jury box, eyes flicked nervously between each other. The gallery sat stunned. Even the reporters who had once doubted the relevance of this case, now scribbling furiously. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so suddenly, so irreversibly, that the space itself felt unrecognizable. Malcolm Pierce said nothing. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped back and let the weight of the moment land where it belonged. On Broderick. On every ruling she had made. On every life she had quietly twisted beneath the gavel. She reached for her gavel now, instinctively, but the room didn't yield as it once did. Her voice, though firm, now trembled beneath its practiced veneer. This proceeding is adjourned until further review. A door opened at the back of the courtroom. 2 federal marshals entered, one holding a sealed envelope, the other moving with practiced, deliberate steps. The judge's words caught midair. She looked up, trying to recenter herself, but her eyes betrayed the truth. She knew what was coming. Judge Evelyn Broderick, the lead marshal said, loud enough for all to hear. You are being placed under investigation for judicial misconduct, violation of due process, and racially biased rulings spanning multiple cases. You are hereby relieved of duty pending federal inquiry. Her lips parted, but no words came. For a moment, she just stood there. This woman who had towered over the system like a shadow, suddenly small. The gavel she gripped didn't fall. Her power had already slipped from her fingers. As the marshals escorted her from the bench, no one in the courtroom moved. It wasn't fear. It was awe. They weren't witnessing a fall. They were witnessing a reckoning. Malcolm turned to Isaiah, whose chains had just become meaningless. This, he said quietly, is what accountability looks like. And for the first time in that courtroom's history, justice wasn't handed down from the bench. It rose from the floor. The courtroom remained hushed long after Judge Evelyn Broderick was escorted away, as if the space itself was trying to understand what had just happened. What had once been her domain now belonged to no one. Yet amidst the debris of her collapsed authority, something else began to rise. Clarity. The newly assigned judge, an experienced and even-tempered man named Harold Winfield, took the bench with calm gravity. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone reminded everyone that justice was still possible, even after so much rot had been exposed. With the eyes of the nation now on the case, Winfield moved swiftly but deliberately. He reviewed the mistrial motion submitted by Malcolm Pierce, flipping through the documentation with a focus that felt refreshing in its fairness. There was no scoffing, no thinly veiled sarcasm, just the solemn responsibility of the law, finally applied without prejudice. Malcolm stood, his voice steady. Your Honor, this courtroom is not just a place for verdicts. It is a place for repair. For my client to be free, it isn't enough that Judge Broderick is gone. He deserves a ruling that sees him. Isaiah Cooper sat motionless beside him, his eyes still clouded with the residue of trauma. He had walked into that courtroom expecting to be convicted. What he never expected was to see the very foundation of that injustice crumble. Judge Winfield nodded. I've reviewed the trial record, the newly submitted evidence, and the conduct of the prior proceedings. He paused, his voice gaining weight. This court finds that the rights of Mr. Cooper were egregiously violated and that the case was conducted under a climate of judicial bias unbefitting any standard of due process. He turned to Isaiah. Mr. Cooper, you are hereby exonerated of all charges. You are free to go. There was no outburst, no cheering, just silence. Deep, reverent, shaking silence. The kind that holds a dignity louder than applause. Isaiah's eyes widened, then dropped to his hands, which slowly opened as though releasing something he'd been gripping for far too long. Malcolm placed a steady hand on his client's shoulder. It's over, he said softly. But they both knew it wasn't truly over. Not for the countless others who never had a Malcolm in their corner, who never had a recording fall into the right hands, who never saw their judge unmasked. Still, this was something. A beginning. A ripple. A shift. And as Isaiah stood, unshackled, seen, whole, the verdict that mattered wasn't just written into the record. It was carved into history. In the quiet that followed Isaiah Cooper's release, the walls of the Charleston courthouse stood as silent witnesses to a day that would be remembered for far more than one man's trial. The The space that once echoed with Judge Evelyn Broderick's cold authority now hummed with something deeper: transformation. For years, the court had operated under her gavel's weight, issuing judgments that carried not only legal consequences, but the shadow of bias too heavy to name out loud. Her word had once been final, her demeanor untouchable. But like all systems built on unchecked power and whispered corruption, hers eventually cracked. And in the space of that fracture, truth spilled out. Malcolm Pierce didn't walk into the courtroom to become a hero. He came in to defend a man named Isaiah, a man like many others, misunderstood, misrepresented, and, if not for the intervention of one determined voice, misjudged. Malcolm had seen it before: judges who condescended, prosecutors who played politics with people's lives, and the silent machinery of racism grinding down the dignity of those who lacked the privilege to push back. But what made this case different wasn't just the client. It was the timing, the preparation, and the moment the system finally exposed itself. From the very beginning, the odds were stacked. Isaiah had done nothing to deserve arrest, let alone a trial. He had been polite, cooperative, and calm during a police encounter gone wrong. But he fit the description, a phrase that has become a tragic anthem in American injustice. He was presumed guilty long before he stepped into that courtroom. And Judge Broderick, cloaked in her years of unchallenged authority, saw no reason to question that presumption. Her smirks, her interruptions, her open disdain, it was all part of a script she'd followed for decades. But Malcolm had done his homework. He knew this wouldn't be just another cross-examination. He came with more than legal arguments. He came with truth. And when he played the video, when Broderick's own voice laid bare her prejudice, everything changed. In one clip, the mask she wore for years shattered. No longer was it rumor or speculation. It was reality, undeniable and public. The fallout was immediate. Marshals walked into her courtroom and escorted her away from the bench she once ruled like a monarch. The power she used to dismiss people with a glance now meant nothing. In her place, justice found its way back into the room through Judge Winfield, who reminded everyone that fairness doesn't require a robe, it requires courage. For Isaiah, the verdict changed his life. But the real victory wasn't just his freedom. It was the acknowledgement of a system that had failed him and finally tried, in some small way, to make that right. His exoneration wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of healing, not just for him, but for all the invisible people who saw themselves in his place. And Malcolm? He left the courtroom not as a man seeking applause, but as someone who understood the work ahead. Because the system didn't fall with Broderick, it flinched. And flinching isn't enough. For every Broderick, there are dozens more, draped in legal language and professional detachment, slowly stealing justice behind the guise of procedure. The lesson in this story runs deeper than courtroom walls. It reminds us that silence is dangerous, especially when it masquerades as professionalism. That neutrality in the face of injustice is not virtue. It is complicity. And that real change rarely comes from shouting. It comes from unwavering resolve, documented truth, and the willingness to keep showing up, even when the system tells you not to. In your everyday life, you may not be a lawyer or a judge, but you are still part of this story. Every time you see someone being overlooked, spoken over, or wrongfully judged, your response matters. Whether it's in a boardroom, a classroom, or even at your kitchen table, your voice carries weight. Justice isn't just won in courtrooms. It's protected in conversations, in policies, in hiring decisions, in how we teach our children and treat our neighbors. Isaiah Cooper's story should not be extraordinary. It should be the norm, that when injustice is exposed, accountability follows. That when someone is wrongfully accused, they are believed, defended, and ultimately freed. That those who misuse power face the consequences, no matter how high their seat is. So let this story stay with you. Let it challenge you to ask hard questions. Let it move you to action, not just awareness. And if this story shook you, inspired you, or reminded you of the kind of world we all deserve to live in, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel. Help us keep these stories alive. Share them. Talk about them. Because change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we tell the truth and keep telling it until the world can no longer look away.